everybody so much for coming out today. Woo! Yeah! Oh, thanks, a few of you. I see who you are. So I'm really excited to be here. So thank you so much for having me here. My name's Kit Hickey. I know most of you all. I'm an entrepreneur in residence and a senior lecturer at MIT Sloan. And I actually came to Sloan about 9 years ago as a student to start my own company, Ministry of Supply. Oh, yep. And, and so when I came back to Sloan, in this capacity, I didn't really know what to expect. And one thing that I was really amazed to find is that the student body hadn't changed at all in their culture. So these folks who I was with in the fall and here now are still, probably as you guys remember, humble, they're entrepreneurial, they're committed to their cohort, they're committed to each other, they're committed to making the world a better place, and still nobody will sit in the front row. So we're gonna have a conversation with a few alumni at Sloan and hear about their experiences, and as well give you guys a chance to ask questions after about 30 minutes. So without further ado, we will get started. And let's hear it for our panelists. All right, well, thanks so much for joining us. And it's been great getting to know you guys a little bit over the past few weeks. So I'm wondering if you guys could start by introducing yourselves in 2 to 3 minutes and kind of let the audience know what you've been up to since Sloan.
Should I start?
Yeah.
All right. Hi, I'm Alex Wright-Gladstein, Sloan MBA class of 2015. And I started a company while I was at Sloan called IR Labs. I met my co-founders through the Energy Ventures class. We participated in the MIT Clean Energy Prize, and we started the company right while we were graduating. And now we're here, located in the Bay Area. We've raised a few rounds of funding. The most recent one was in October, $24 million. And but we have yet to get product out into the world. So what our product is that we're putting fiber optic communications inside computers, which makes them faster and more energy efficient. It turns out that the semiconductor industry has gotten really good at making chips more powerful, but hasn't kept up in how we bring data in and out of chips. And so it means that a majority of the time, the chips in data centers are idling, waiting for data. So we're solving that problem by bringing fiber optics inside servers to move more data in and out of chips. And it also saves a lot of power to reduce all that idling happening in data centers.
Great. By the way, that was the humble part. We raised $25 million, but we haven't put product out yet. That was a demonstration of the humility. I am Rami Il-Khatib, class of 99. We were just talking, it's going to be our 20-year anniversary this year, so it's amazing. It doesn't feel like 20 years, it feels like 4 or 5. I'm the founder of Acero Capital. We're an early-stage VC firm based here in Menlo Park. In terms of what I've done since Sloan, I think that was the question. Coming out of Sloan, I was always interested in venture, but for me, the plan was to spend a couple of years working in finance. So I spent a couple of years working in investment banking. Luckily, that was a short stint. For me, that was sort of the path I chose because before Sloan, my entire career had been in engineering, product, engineering management. So I really wanted to sort of be a practitioner in the finance field before pursuing a position in VC. So that's kind of how it worked out. I started my career in VC in a somewhat non-traditional way in the sense that I didn't start in Silicon Valley. I was based here in the Valley at the time, but I was recruited by a fund in North Carolina. And one thing about the VC industry in the Valley, once you leave the Valley, nobody kind of thinks about you, or it's very Valley-centric. But it was a great experience. I actually moved to North Carolina for 1.5 years and then came back and worked for a total of 8 years for that North Carolina firm. And then about 7 years ago, I got the opportunity to start Acero Capital. My journey into kind of starting a VC firm happened because I was approached by the largest limited partner, the largest investor in the prior firm that I worked out in North Carolina. And we were out kind of pitching them on what would have been our fourth fund. And they said, look, we think, you've done great stuff. We think you should start your own firm and we want to back you. So that was kind of how the opportunity came together. Now, from that conversation to closing the fund, it was 2.5 years. Nothing is as easy as it initially sounds. But yeah, so that's kind of what I've been up to. In terms of Acero, it's somewhat of a unique model. It's a small team. I'm the only general partner. It's a $150 million fund focused primarily on early stage enterprise software. So that's been kind of my post-Sloan journey so far.
Awesome. My name is Rohini Chakravarti, and I'm also a Sloan 99. So Rami and I were classmates at Sloan, and he also kindly hosts our Sloan gatherings here. When and if you guys move out to Silicon Valley, you'll get to see him once a year. So my background, I was an engineer. Actually, I worked in Silicon Valley before I went to Sloan. So I was at Bay Networks. I was a design engineer, so I did chip design, board design. And at Sloan, I stayed sort of semi-technical, but I made my way into VC soon after Sloan. So I went to Intel Capital right after Sloan. I was there for 7 years. And then I went to NEA as a partner here in Silicon Valley. And I was there for almost 9 years. Did a lot of investing in enterprise, in some consumer, some energy. And I was also part of the India Investment Committee. And I left NEA, and I was between leaving NEA and where I am now. I'm a partner at a firm called NGP Capital. We're a growth stage investor here in Silicon Valley. I also had a stint as a co-founder of a company, India-US company, and had a chance to run that company as well. So mainly an investor background, but obviously Sloan was a turning point. I actually found Intel Capital through a classmate of mine. She was the one, she had worked for Andy Grove while she was at Intel, and she recommended that I go to Intel Capital right after Sloan. That's how I ended up in VC. So I did this trek, the similar trek in 1998. So just, just so you know, it was fascinating then, and I'm sure you've had a great time out here.
Rami, I want to start with you because launching a fund isn't something we hear a lot about. So I'm curious about kind of those first few years, what it's like starting a fund, how you establish your investment priorities, and maybe a little bit of those 2.5 years of actually raising your capital.
Yeah, for me, it was really all about, so it's interesting, especially when you kind of get approached by a limited partner, the temptation is to jump on it, which I wanted to. But the most important exercise was for me to really be honest about what kind of investing I think I'm good at, and translate that into a fund strategy and a firm strategy. And what I came up with was kind of different from what my backers wanted to do. What they had in mind is that since I didn't have a team, single GP, they really thought that, hey, let's ask Rami to raise a $25 to $40 million seed fund, right? Which is, there's nothing wrong with that. That's great, but that's not the kind of investing I know how to do. My investing, experience is more of a company building style. I know how to come in very early at the Series A. When I say very early, meaning I invest in Series A companies without really caring much if they have customers or revenue or anything like that. I do care about the technology and the IP and the product and the technical team. So looking at the kind of investing where I thought I would be successful, it required putting together a $150 million fund, not a $40 million fund. So that really was, for me, kind of a key turning point, right? Because it changed kind of the fundraising exercise from being, 2 months to 2.5 years. But it was really worth it, right? I still remember conversations of friends or, folks who would say, or even my wife who would be like, just take it and go ahead and start making some seed stage investments and build a track record, but really kind of sticking to what I knew was how I was going to be successful was very helpful. So a lot of thought went in advance in terms of kind of the strategy of the firm. And the other interesting thing, I think we were talking before the panel, starting a new fund from a cold start, it's sort of a 10-year journey, really. Because you put it together, and then you want to put some infrastructure around you. You want to go out, you want to source, and then once you source, it takes a good 4 to 5 years before some of your companies start to mature. So that's a little bit about that kind of initial.
And did you know it was going to be a 10-year journey when you started?
I guess theoretically I knew, but I didn't really appreciate. We were talking earlier. I'm in year 7, and I'm still waiting for a chance to take a real vacation, right? That hasn't happened, but it will happen someday.
Thanks. So Rohini, moving on to you. A lot of these folks are going to be starting companies. They're going to be joining companies. They're going to be in a room with somebody like you pitching their idea. What do you look for when you're thinking about investment? What advice do you have for these folks that are kind of pitching to a VC like yourself?
Sure. So I think, just lifting off of what Rami was saying, clearly you want to have, you're going to go through your first round of financing in, a seed round or a Series A round of financing. I think, all VCs evaluate companies through 3 lenses. You have the technology/product lens, you have the market lens, and you have the team lens. And so when you walk into any venture firm, you can assume that's how they're evaluating at any given stage of the company. And if you're very, very early stage, clearly the technology and product matter a lot, and therefore the founding team matter a lot, right? You have very little data. You're really trying to figure out, okay, is this team qualified to do whatever they have set out to do? And that's kind of where it starts. And the second thing that they're also looking for is to see whether you can plan out milestones that make sense. So are you raising a round of financing for a particular milestone? So there is a time component to that. Typically, VCs want you to think 1.5 to 2 years ahead, and milestone financing is based on that. And then it's also a question of what product milestone or what market milestone do you think you can reach with what you're trying to raise. So that's the business plan component of things. At my current firm, I'm actually looking at what we think of as early growth. So what we define that as, the names have changed a lot. So a Series B is no longer a Series B in the Valley, as you guys probably know. But I look for companies that have just gotten to product market fit. And the way I think about that is, have you been able to sell the same product to more than one customer? It's not directly correlated with revenue. So sometimes you'll have a company that will have a lot of revenue, but that they're selling something that's sort of custom for one particular customer. I'm really looking for things that are it's really a product that is applicable to more than one customer. And then you start evaluating how big that market is. We focus on enterprise, so I do a lot of enterprise infrastructure, storage, hybrid cloud is a big area of investment right now. I'm doing data-oriented companies, and all the way up to the application stack within the enterprise. So fairly focused on the enterprise, but our firm also does smart mobility. I think I was mentioning to a few people here that we've been interested in investing in some interesting smart mobility companies and a little bit in digital health. So you kind of want to walk into a VC, know what area they invest in, what stage they invest in, and are you in that ballpark, because then you'll have a really good conversation. Happy to chat more, yeah.
Perfect, thanks. So Alex, you did a lot while you were at MIT Sloan. You were in E&I. You TA'd for Bill Olet, spent a lot of time at the Trust Center, you took Energy Ventures, did all the right things. But of course, Sloan can't prepare you for everything when kind of starting your company. So I'm curious about what's been kind of the most surprising or the most difficult aspects over the last 4 years of starting your company.
So I would say first, Sloan did prepare me amazingly well. I took probably every entrepreneurship class that was available at Sloan. I went to Sloan with the purpose of starting a company, and I just wanted to soak up all the knowledge I could. And it's amazing how much you can learn just talking to other entrepreneurs, hearing their stories. You know, I don't know about you guys, but when I was sitting in your place, I was hearing from every guest, you know, lecturer that came into a class who was an entrepreneur, you know, all of them said the hardest thing about starting a company is hiring people, hiring the right people, and then, you know, having to fire people if you end up making the wrong decisions. You know, there were these trends that I picked up that really every entrepreneur talked about that made me much more thoughtful about how I did certain things like hiring, which I don't think I would have been that way if it hadn't been for the Sloan education. So I learned a lot, but what did I not learn? I would say that I really didn't have an appreciation for the trendiness that exists when you arrive in Silicon Valley. I lived in this wonderful bubble that really appreciates technology and innovation and ideas in Boston while I was at MIT. And then I arrived out here and realized that, at the time I arrived, people were just investing in AI. Or actually, no, at the time, people weren't investing in AI. People had been into hardware the prior year, but hardware was no longer an in thing anymore with VCs. So I couldn't pitch hardware. I wouldn't, you know, go anywhere. I was like, well, we're not only hardware, we're the hardest type of hardware, semiconductors. So they're like, oh, there are a couple firms that are still around that are kind of into it. Go try and talk to them. And so it was hard to navigate this realization that in the world of investing, people really do try to chase trends. And at first, I was kind of, you know, unhappy about that. I was angry about it. You know, this is so dumb. Like, so what? I'm not doing the coolest new thing. But my idea is amazing, and it's going to change the world. They should care about that. But over time, I realized there's very good reason that VCs do pay attention to trends. It's when markets are transitioning that the most value is created. If there isn't big change going on in a market, you're probably not going to have a very easy time as a new entrant. You know, in the most simple example, if there are already 5 dry cleaners in the neighborhood, if you open a new dry cleaner, you're probably not going to be a runaway success. But if you go somewhere with no dry cleaners and open a new dry cleaner, you probably will be a runaway success, right? The same thing applies in startups. That's how most VCs have made their wealth. And so it's smart that that's what they do. But what I've learned is it doesn't mean that I have to go and start a company that matches whatever the trend is. It's possible to relate what we're doing to existing trends and to really think about the company I'm starting in the broader environment of what's happening in the markets. And if I can tell that story and relate my startup to those trends, I'll be much more successful. And, you know, even convincing investors that you know, they're seeing something that's a little different. We're not just, you know, the 60th AI semiconductor, you know, chip company out there. We're doing something very different that no one else is doing, but that will impact AI just as much. That's where people get interested. So thinking about those trends in that type of way has been helpful.
That's really helpful. So how do you convey what IR Labs is doing in the context of the trends that are currently happening?
So I just, you know, when I was fundraising for the Series A last year, it was during a big trend in machine learning and AI startups. And there are now about 60 AI hardware startups that have made chips that are competing with NVIDIA's GPU, you know, hardware accelerators so you can do machine learning training or inference faster. And so rather than, you know, trying to say, hey, we're making another, you know, machine learning machine, which isn't exactly what we're doing, I gave examples of how our technology will speed up AI workloads. So just relating it to AI and talking about how we actually have partnerships and relationships with companies that are building these machines and who want to use our product in those machines helped.
That was a great scope to develop. So speaking of trends, Rami, I want to turn to you. And you've kind of been in the software industry for many years as an investor, sitting on boards. How have you seen what changes have you seen happen in the sector, and where do you see the sector going?
Sure. So I guess I'll answer first from kind of the tech perspective and then sort of the investor financial perspective. So from a tech perspective, for me in enterprise software, the kind of two seismic changes are now, 10 to 12 years old. They are, I mean, if I were to summarize them in 6 letters, I would say iOS and AWS, right? It's mobile and cloud, right? iOS came out in 2007 and AWS, I believe, 2006. And although we are now, 12, 13 years into those seismic shifts, from the perspective, at least from my perspective as an early stage enterprise software investor, these are still the seismic shifts that are impacting, most of the big things that happen in my industry and impacting how I look at opportunities and what opportunities we want to invest in. Whereas from kind of the investor strategy and firm strategy perspective, the trend that I've seen in the past 5 to 7 years is that, when I first got interested in VC and I was thinking about starting my own firm, really at least in the early stage enterprise space, the world kind of revolved around the Series A funds. You had a number of, call it $400 million Series A funds that essentially were kind of the epicenter of the investing, early stage investing in enterprise. Now that has transitioned. Most of those funds, there are a couple of exceptions, but most of those funds have now become multi-billion dollar, multi-stage investors. So for my firm, that really created sort of the opportunity, frankly, to kind of be on the other end of the spectrum, to be extremely focused. We only do Series A. We only do it early, but we're very focused on having as large ownership as possible in the early stage. So as I mentioned earlier, we don't want to be seed investors. We want to be the largest possible Series A check at the earliest possible point at which we as a team can have a lot of conviction that we understand the technology, that we understand the IP, and that it fits within the cloud and mobility trends that I mentioned. I would say those are kind of the biggest trends that at least sort of impact how I do my business day to day.
Perfect. So Rohini, I have a question for you, and Rami, you can jump in as well. But what advice do you have for folks in the audience that are kind of thinking about going into VC, whether thinking about it for an internship or after graduation or a few years after graduation?
Yeah. Well, I think, and I have a couple of comments on what Rami said as well, but let me answer Kit's question first. I think one of the questions I get asked is, how did you get into VC, which is why I gave you the longish introduction on how I got into VC. I went straight after business school, right? Which I think, it's not a very organized sector still, so it's still unusual for people to just go into venture right after business school. But I think that is one entry point, and people do go in there and rise through the partnerships to become partners and so on. I think probably the most well-regarded way among VC to come in is come in as a partner after you've been an entrepreneur. And I think from the MIT Sloan perspective, there's so much going on in entrepreneurship, and there's so many interesting companies that are happening there. I would say if you wanted to go into VC, you should still go into a startup first and try to make your way into VC through that. Get to know people, get to know market trends. And I think there are several other paths into VC as well. People have been really great analysts and market predictors. People who have had some market insights into that, and some of them have come in from. There's Kirsten Green at Forerunner was a equity research analyst, and she really had some interesting perspectives into retail and the new retail that happened, and she's been a phenomenal investor. And so there have been multiple paths into VC, but the main thing there is to network your way into it. I think it's not a path as in other paths, as you guys know. So all the things that you're doing and the way you want to make your way into VC is to either look for things right away or go work at a company and enjoy yourself there and then start looking for opportunities. Yeah. So I did have a comment on Rami's thing as well. I think in the software space, he's absolutely right. The big changes that have happened have been mobile and cloud. And so from our perspective, what we have actually been doing is to look at the application layer. You can look at market opportunities where people have come in with software that's now 10, 15 years old, right? So you look at a Salesforce, or you look at a Marketo, or you look at even a ServiceNow, and you'll see that things look old, right? Many of them were not built for the mobile user experience. They were not really architected for the cloud stack. They were not really architected with all the developer tools that are common now. So I think there is sort of a richness and a huge upgrade that's happening in software that builds on a lot of the older trends. And I think the same is happening with infrastructure. So you have the enterprises that actually innovated first with virtualization and a lot of the internal infrastructure within the enterprise. And now that they've seen what the cloud has done, there's actually a redo happening with enterprise infrastructure. So software within the enterprise is also changing very, very fast. And there are many, many, many interesting companies coming out of that.
And I can maybe comment on the different kind of path to VC. So I agree with Rohini that there are just a lot of different paths. And from my perspective, you just really got to decide. I mean, as Rohini said, in my case, I wanted to do some investment banking first. And I think Rohini's advice is great. Maybe you work as an entrepreneur first. But once you get to that point where you really decide that you want to get into venture, I think you have to be open to a lot of different paths. Kind of a standard path of coming out of B school and joining a very large established platform is one way to do it. But as hopefully kind of my experience shows you, I mean, there's just a lot of different ways to go about it. And but there has to be a lot of conviction and passion about it, because people see that. I mean, if you really have, for whatever reason, just passion about the industry, maybe passion about a specific sector within the industry, and you're really convinced that you have something to add, I'm then convinced that you'll be able to land your position in VC. It may take a while. It will require a lot of networking, but people are going to see through the conviction and passion that you have. And frankly, there is actually on the VC side, at least from my experience, hunger for seeing folks who are just very, just have very clear idea about what they want to do. And the only thing I would add is that do a lot of networking within the sector. Let's say you want to be a VC in the enterprise software space. Show up to your networking meetings having, really being knowledgeable about what's happening in that space and being very well networked with founders and entrepreneurs in that space.
Perfect. So I have one more question, and then we'll open it up to you all. But so Alex, you just had a huge milestone with raising $24 million Series A round. Congrats. Can you talk a little bit about that fundraising process?
Yeah, let's see.
Where to start?
Yeah. I feel like I had thought of something in particular I wanted to talk about. Was there a more specific? Okay.
So how long did the process take, kind of from start to finish? And any advice you would give for founders in this room that are thinking? So for some context, after Delta V, the number one issue that comes up with founders is fundraising is the hardest thing. I wasn't expecting it to be this hard. I had no idea what I was getting into. I'm leaving the cocoon of MIT and out in the real world. Does any of that resonate with you?
Yes, very much. Okay, fundraising is really, really hard and not fun in general to most people I know. And it's hard because, it can take much longer than you expect for our first round. Coming out of MIT, we waited a few months. Thankfully, we had a little buffer before we had to start fundraising, but then it took, I think it took 6 months before we closed, and maybe that doesn't sound too long in retrospect, but it felt like forever. When we expected it to take 3 months, and taking twice as long was really tough.
And you start again soon?
Huh?
And you start again soon.
And then you start again soon, it's true.
Yeah.
And you just talk to so many people and you get a lot of no's, so picking yourself up, all that stuff that you've heard before. I think what I've learned though, especially coming out of MIT and knowing how most people are here, is that it is so important to have conviction. And that sounds obvious, but you can't repeat it enough to yourself. Mm-hmm. When you start fundraising, you all of a sudden feel like you're in a very lopsided conversation. Every VC that you talk to has a huge amount of experience with so many startups. You know, they've probably invested in a dozen startups and heard the stories of hundreds, maybe thousands of startups. And so just the sum of their experience in entrepreneurship will always outweigh yours. And so it can be very easy as soon as they give you their first gotcha question to think, oh my gosh, do I really know that, you know, I disagree with what they're saying. You know, oftentimes they'll, you know, say something, oh, you know, what you said there isn't true, this other thing is true. And maybe you kind of feel like what you're saying is true and you disagree, but it's easy to be caught off guard. And I would just say have conviction in your beliefs, have conviction in how your company is going to change the world and your view of the world as it needs to be. Because the truth is that nobody else has ever done what you're doing. And as smart as they are and as much experience as they do have in similar things, literally no one has ever done what you're doing. That's why you're doing it. And they are, I think what I found is actually most VCs are very open to being educated. They want to be educated by the entrepreneurs who are pitching them. And you know, they want to have their assumptions questioned and be corrected. And that will build their respect for you. And so once you become comfortable in your beliefs and knowledgeable enough about the field that you're entering, you'll be able to present your pitch with that level of conviction that will make them want to invest in you.
That's such a good answer. Does that resonate with you too?
Absolutely.
Perfect.
Yeah. So I was going to say that, you know, so what you heard from Alex is people call it selling for the right to buy, right? So you really need to remind yourself that you will have options at the end of this. So, you know, the best companies actually always have options at the end, you know. So you're selling and you're trying to convince an VC to invest in your company, but you should be convinced that at the end of this process, you will have choices and you will get to pick who you want to work with. So you are actually interviewing the VCs at the same time that, you know, you are pitching the company as well. And so as part of your conviction, you need to, you know, just think of it as, I'm selling this, but it doesn't mean that you know, at the end of this process, I'm the one who gets to choose. You want to keep that, it's the positivity that will actually drive you. And clearly Alex had that, you know, through the tough times. It'll take you through the tough times because you know that at the end of the day, you'll have the last word.
Completely agree.
Yeah, and going through the process that you're taught here at Sloan is super important. You know, talking to 1,000,001 customers before you go out and fundraise is so helpful because those are the conversations that help you then educate the investors.
Perfect. Thanks. So now we're going to open it up to questions, and I think we have a few handheld mics to go around.
Hi, my name is Zona, first year MBA, as most of the people here. Okay. So I have a question for Alex. I really kind of resonated with something you said just now. So basically trying to start something in a market, in a sector that's not like a buzzword, that's not so sexy, where all the investors are going after, can be really hard. And especially if you're talking to people and they're like, yeah, it's not something we're seeing that much, it's a niche market, or like how did you, and then you said it's really important to have that conviction. So how did you manage to do that over the years, you know, have conviction while working, while trying to start something in the sector that's not so sexy, and then keep knocking on the doors, keep knocking on the closed doors? Would love to hear more from you.
Yeah, I think, you know, first of all, there will always be a huge number of investors who just don't invest in the type of thing you're doing. Like if I had tried pitching you,
Right.
you know, that would have made no
It's not a
sense.
fit, yeah.
So just doing your research and making sure that you're pitching the right investors, you know, both the right VC firms, but also the right partner at the firm is super important. And then, you know, yes, there are these buzzwords and these trends, but if you're starting your company, it's probably because you see a transition in a marketplace. You see an opportunity that exists because of some kind of transformation that's happening. So paint that picture. You know, start with that picture of what's changing in the world that creates this big opportunity for them to make a lot of money. And it's still, you know, 9 times out of 10, they'll just say, sorry, that's not what we do. But
and it doesn't have to be VC money either, right? I mean, if you're doing something where, to your point, kind of the market has not yet caught up with your vision, what you're doing, there's somebody who cares about it, right? Otherwise, you wouldn't be doing it. So maybe you go talk to corporate investors, maybe you go talk to strategics, maybe you try and initially fund through NRE with customers. I mean, there's a lot of different ways to fund before you kind of, it doesn't have to be
angel
a VC.
investors, or maybe it's not even a venture company that you're starting, and maybe you shouldn't be pitching VCs in the first place, and maybe once you realize that, you'll be much happier because you're not giving up a large slice of your company to somebody who's misaligned with your incentives. It's a very specific type of company where it even makes sense to raise VC money. And there are plenty of other ways to get something out into the world. You know, Kickstarter, for example, is another great one. So keep your mind open and don't think you have to follow this one path that, you know, gets a lot of news coverage, but it doesn't make sense for everyone.
Hi, Ernesto Gaja. So I was wondering, what is sort of the right time for a company to start looking for investor capital, whether that be sort of angel, seed, or you know, VC money? And what are the sort of good reasons to look for investor capital, and what are the sort of reasons that you have people come to you and you think this person is not raising money for the right reasons?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think, you know, historically, I guess, I mean, the traditional VC model was they talked about the J curve, right, which is, there are 2 J curves, but, you know, the one J curve was that you have an investment period. So you have a product idea, and it takes a certain amount of time for you to actually pull off that product idea, and then there is a huge payoff, potential payoff at the end of the, so you essentially want to first figure out, as Alex was pointing out, whether this product idea that you have has that risk period up front that says, if I can actually pull off if I can get an investment to pull off a new product or open up this new business model or open up a new market, is there a potential large payoff at the end of that, and what's that market look like, right? So you at least want to have some formulation of that in your mind. But then there's also all the blocking and tackling that you have to do. You have to have a team to get this started, and you hopefully have a product idea that you're working on, and usually some technology underpinning where you can, with the initial team, you can build this product by yourselves. And so I would say from a seed round perspective, even from a seed round perspective now, it's moved to the point where the cost of developing things are so low, especially for software and so on. People want to see something built, and that there are people in there who can build that. And then we also be able to tell the story or the narrative of how this could be a big idea or this could be a big transformative market. And I think that would be the starting point for you to go out and raise a round of financing. Once you convince yourself that that's there, and then you go through the process of convincing somebody else that it's there.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that. I totally agree, and it's a little bit of an art and a science, because I think, again, just thinking about it from an enterprise software perspective, on the one hand, you want to delay the fundraising as much as possible so you can make more progress, so your fundraising is quicker, you get a higher valuation, but at the same time, the balancing force is you don't want to let go of a market opportunity by missing 6 months or 12 months when you could have scaled faster. So it's definitely, you know, somewhat of an art and a science. But I would say for a software product, make as much progress as you can in creating your MVP, for example. Then you raise a round that is very focused on product development, And then at the end of that, you really hopefully are starting to demonstrate product market fit. And then you raise a larger round to scale your sales and marketing. That would be kind of one simple way to just think about it.
Ken Kirshner, I'm a local entrepreneur in micromobility here in Menlo Park. Kind of diving a little bit deeper into Alex's comment about not every business is a venture qualified business. A question for Rohini and Rami. The number one reason I've heard venture capitalists turn down an investment opportunity is because the TAM isn't big enough. That market is too small. If that's correct, what's the minimum size TAM that you guys look for?
So this is one where I'm somewhat of a contrarian, right? Because in my opinion, I mean, sometimes that's a legitimate reason to turn down a business, but sometimes the TAM is not big enough because maybe you're creating a new sector or you're creating a new way of doing something that is not calculated as part of a TAM. So, rather than tell you it's got to be, 10 billion or 20 billion, I would just say I'm personally kind of skeptical that is, at least for early stage investors. What was the TAM of the, ride-hailing market before Uber, right? I mean, they kind of sort of invented that, right? So that's how I look at it.
Yeah, I think it goes back to what Alex said about whether you are going into a market tailwind, right? So it can be a small market now, but if it feels like you're solving a problem that will, it's the why now question. So what has changed? What are you building here that's different, and why could it potentially be a big market? Versus if it's a very specific problem to something that you've experienced, in a prior role, and it's really not generalizable, and there is no big market opportunity that is sort of coming to this particular solution. I think that's kind of where it's obviously not a numbers-based assessment, especially at the early stages. It's really a question of what is that transition that you're capitalizing on that changes the game, and therefore how big could it be? So I was talking the other day to someone, and they were, we were talking about Arista, which is it's in the market for networking gear. And when they first started out, they were at the tippy top of the market. They had a very high performant box that sold essentially to high frequency trading type applications, financial services oriented. And even when the CEO, when she took the job, she thought that the market was a $50 million market, very small. Like but between the technology that they had and the people they had and the ability for them to actually keep accreting other market segments, you could see your way to how this could be potentially a much larger market, and one day even challenge a Juniper or challenge a Cisco, right? So you kind of start thinking about, if things go right for this solution and for this technology, what are the other things, what are the other options that open up for them? So I think the market analysis is really that way, right? Where if you look at the solution and you say it's a very niche solution and it's not clear that it takes advantage of any of the market transitions I'm seeing, then maybe I don't want to be investing there. And so that's kind of how you start with your market analysis. You'll fill out the numbers. I mean, we do fill out the numbers afterwards. Like, I'm looking at an infrastructure company and I'll say, okay, the cloud market is now, it's $26 billion for AWS. So now that's a large market, but that's really not it doesn't provide you any information to say the cloud market is 26 billion, therefore any cloud company is interesting. That really, you can't do it at that level of scale.
I know you didn't ask me, but I just have a few other things. So one is exactly what you said, which is you have your initial market and then you have your follow-on market. And so just make sure that you're not shooting yourself in the foot and only talking about that initial market if the real opportunity is in that follow-on one. Exactly like, this high performance, Arista example versus, I think they were the fastest growing hardware company or hardware company I've seen ever. Their revenue was insane. So make sure you're talking about the end goal and the big market down the line. And it's good to show focus with that small market up front, as long as you make sure the investor's aware there's that bigger opportunity. Also, I'm going to be a lot more concrete. You'll probably be mad at me for doing this, but if you want to raise money from a top-tier VC, you need to show that that your company will exit at $1 billion or above. If you can't paint that story, you're talking to the wrong people. You shouldn't be raising from top-tier VCs, or really most VCs.
Yeah, it's a big payoff that I was talking about, which is if things go right. I mean, VCs think in terms of if things go right, how big could this be? I mean, obviously we know that not every company will have things go right, not every team will work, and not every product will work, right? So it's in the risk business. But ultimately, if things do go right, how big could this be? I think part of it is the entrepreneur painting that picture, and part of it is the learned knowledge of the VC coming in and saying, oh, I saw this in this market, and maybe the analog here works as well.
Yeah, I saw a quote, I think, from Mark Andreessen, maybe it was, they need to expect every company to exit at $1 billion because they need to assume that 9 out of 10 will not do that. So they need to make sure that the one that's successful is at that level. Every single one needs to have that potential.
Yeah, no, I agree. And that math really works for large VCs, small VCs. I mean, wherever you go. I fully agree that no one is typically going to invest unless they believe it's going to be a $1 billion+ opportunity. If you're confronted with a time that is small today, I would like to challenge entrepreneurs to think about how is it that your idea and your company becomes the company that changes that TAM and transitions into a larger.
Or maybe it doesn't, and this is a $100 million opportunity, and maybe that's great, and you just shouldn't be raising from these large VC firms, and instead, think about Kickstarter or other ways to get money. Angel investors are great investors for if you can exit at $100 million, that would be fantastic for most angels. So just think about the right investor for what you're doing.
James Fox, Sloan Fellow. Question for the two VCs on the panel. Can you share with us an experience where you had a missed opportunity, where you wished you had put the money in? What were the reasons why you didn't, and what were the thoughts afterwards in terms of what you have learned?
Yes, I can mention a lot, but actually when I was talking about earlier, and it was right before I started Acero Capital, but I had an opportunity to invest in a bridge loan financing for Tesla back in, I can't remember if it was 09 or 010, but it was an extremely tough period for the entire industry. And I actually looked at it very hard and I passed. And last time I checked, it was a 90x return on that bridge loan. So huge mistake. And the funny thing is, my wife was telling me, just do it. I think you should do it. And I would say, on what basis do you know that? Do you say that? My wife is not in the VC industry, and she's a very smart woman. She's like, well, it's Tesla, it's electric cars, you should do it. I'm like, yeah, you don't know what you're talking about. Missed out on a 90x.
Yeah, so I think the anti-portfolio, is like Bessemer has perfected it. If you go to the Bessemer's website, they have they call it the Bessemer list of things they missed out. They missed out Google because it's like this guy's in a garage somewhere. So at NEA, we, obviously we did a number of amazing investments. We were in Salesforce, WebEx, a lot of SaaS companies. It was NEA had invested in going back 3 companies in SGI and I believe Netscape too, but we missed out on YouTube, and partly because of price, which now you think about it, you're like, really? And so, but price discovery on an early stage, like 2 guys walk in and say, oh, we have this idea for sharing videos. It's like, okay, they came in with a good introduction and they seem like good people, but how do you price this? And, lost it on price. And I think we passed on Pinterest, didn't get it. So, so there have been, obviously it's very hard to see in the early stages on companies that really, really work. But on the other hand, we caught some companies later. We invested in MuleSoft later, invested in House, which was at a 4. I mean, I don't know if we can say the valuations, but anyway, it was a multi-hundred million valuation for a company that had no revenues, right? And so it was, you catch up later when you see some of these things working. But it is a very, you're really kind of feeling your way through the dark in some cases. There are entrepreneurs, sometimes they don't even know what they have, and they're not explaining things very well. It's like, user-generated content put on the website somewhere. How much, it's like you're going to give it away for free. How much storage cost does it take to get, like, even if it works, won't the storage cost burn you? Like, so things like that. You worry about those things. And sometimes those matter, sometimes they don't.
By the way, there's the inverse of that too. I mean, sometimes you really want to get into a deal and you get beat, and then 4 years later, you're so thankful that you got beat.
Like, dodged bullets. Yeah.
You dodged the bullet, so that happens too. It's tough.
Yeah. Yeah.
Last question.
2, I think.
Oh no, last question.
Yeah.
All right. This is KP from Brick and Mortar Ventures. Look, I think we talked a lot about raising capital, and this question's for Alex. What is the right company to invest or to raise capital from venture side? And I think to answer one of the questions raised here, I do believe there is a whole private thriving business that should never go into venture capital fundraising, and we can talk about that anytime. Question for Alex here would be, what is the flip side of fundraising, which is, were you ever worried about raising too much capital as an entrepreneur, and what were the implications of that if someone offered you a large check? I know we don't really talk about that here, but actually we've seen a lot of startups who've gone that journey and have unfortunately regretted that.
Yeah, and that's one of the warnings that I actually heard from other entrepreneurs when I was in your guys' place at Sloan. Don't go for too high a valuation, counterintuitively, don't raise too much money too fast. And the reason for those warnings is a real one. If you raise too much money too early, your valuation has to be pretty high if you're going to support a very high valuation or a very high fundraising amount. And it's super important to be able to always continue to increase the valuation of your company from round to round. Otherwise, you'll have a down round, and that's not much fun for anybody who's currently part of the company. And that's even, especially true. I've seen, some trends in my own semiconductor industry lately where, companies are raising hundreds of millions of dollars, and, it's an expensive business to be in. But the amount of, the exit they're going to have to be able to give a payout to all their investors is just so astronomically high. And when you look at the number of companies that have raised, like the number of companies in a specific field that have raised huge amounts of money, probably not all of them are going to have those multi-billion-dollar exits. So sometimes what ends up happening is the company just never really exits because they can never get to the IPO or the acquisition that has a high enough value that it makes sense to exit. The investors won't be getting a lot of money back, and so they don't want to let it happen. And companies can kind of hobble along for a long time just trying to find that right exit scenario and having to keep raise interim rounds, and that can be pretty painful. So, it can feel pretty great when someone wants to give you more money than you thought you needed, or give you a higher valuation than you were asking for or expecting, but make sure that you weigh the pros and cons, and that you'll be able to really have the next round or the exit that can continue to raise that value.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think of it as momentum management, and frankly, fundraising and valuation is one piece of it, but as a private company, you want to be able to show momentum in the market in terms of the people you're hiring, in terms of the PR that you're getting, in terms of the customers that you're getting, and valuation is probably the most visible aspect of it. And it's something that I think a lot of founders overlook. It's easy to kind of get excited and kind of jump on the opportunity initially, but you're really going to be thinking how you're going to be showing that things are moving up to the right on all those dimensions as the journey progresses.
And too much money is really a source of indiscipline. I think, once you raise $100 million, it's like, even if you did zero-based budgeting, which we were all taught to do at various jobs, now you have $100 million, a lot of things are above the line, and, you just spend on things that you really shouldn't. I think, if you had capital as a constraint, I think you're just a little bit more careful on what you spend on, and more clever with that. I think so, certainly in this environment, entrepreneurs should think about both of those things. Are we raising enough money? And are we raising too much money? I think both of those are important questions.
I have one other comment I just thought of, which is that I think sometimes or oftentimes the firms that will offer higher valuations more money are the ones who might not have as much expertise in the field that you're in. And I do think it's much more important to have investors who have experience doing the type of thing that you're doing than it is to have investors who will give you more money or a higher valuation, but might not have experience doing what you're doing. Because as soon as you close the round, that person's joining your board, and you're having all the tough conversations with them, or strategic conversations with them. And if they have real-world experience of having done this before, it makes such a big difference. It's a huge value add just to have that extra voice and opinion to get their thoughts from. So. And I think if the investor has experience in your field, they'll probably be more well-calibrated on what the right valuation is and the right fundraising amount is.
All right, well, thank you so much to our panelists. Let's hear it. And then also to everyone in the audience. So I know I can speak for the E&I track when I say that they've really come together and become a great cohort. But really, the MIT Alumni Network, this has really been a first taste into how kind of diverse, warm, and welcoming that network is, and how that will help you, whether today playing this track, 6 months down the line, or years and years down the line. So I wanted to say thank you so much for you guys sharing your stories and insights, and thank you everyone for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.